When we think about the things that affect our modern life, it's often modern things, right? Whether that be media or whether that be politics or social norms. We think about the things that are happening right now that affect us. But what if I told you that ancient Greek statues played a huge role in how you perceive your body to the current day, as well as things like lawn ornaments existing? So, we're going to talk about that today. And we're not just going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what the Greeks actually looked like in comparison to their statues, and why these statues look the way that they do. So, if you do know a lot about these statues, this is going to be fun because this is going to be a new perspective. If you don't know anything about these statues, you're in for a wild ride. So let's get started. We are going to cover embodiments, so what these statues were meant to do, why they look the way they did. We are going to talk about the color of these statues and their lack thereof. And then we are going to end that off on the stories that these statues tell. So, let's get started. The first point I want to make is what the statues look like, right? If you're unfamiliar, these statues were made of marble or of bronze. These statues were without color and purely aesthetic, largely muscular, that kind of thing. And on the aesthetics, in a 2014 article entitled Defaced Statues, Idealism and Iconoclasm in Hegel's Aesthetics, the author states that, particularly for these marble statues, the whiteness allows the spectator to enjoy a beauty uncontaminated by the charms of and irritations of color, thus to experience a strictly disinterested pleasure, pure aesthetic judgment. So the author here is saying that because these statues are without color, there is something that innately focuses the mind on clearly looking at the aesthetics of these statues. Aesthetics that, by the way, still inform the way that we view ourselves. But why did they look that way? Why were they white? Why were they this physique? What was happening there? Well, first, a lot of these men were meant to be demigods or gods, so they were meant to look unrealistic. And we'll get more to this point in the stories section in just a little bit. But these statues were meant to look subhuman or hyperhuman, above what the normal human standard looked like. And also based on the stories they were telling. These statues needed to be strong. They needed to look like the heroes of antiquity that they were portraying. So now we're going to talk about an interesting subject, color, right? We just discussed in the last section that they weren't colored, but what if I told you that wasn't exactly true? Our current day findings came out in an article entitled Coloring Antiquity, that these statues actually have been found with hints of paint, suggested that they were in fact painted. One of the authors of this article, Coloring Antiquity, states, saying that you've seen these sculptures when you've seen only the white marble is comparable to somebody coming from the beach and saying they've seen a whale when what they have seen is a whale skeleton washed up on the beach. So obviously this has had huge impacts, but what does it actually change? Well, it changes how human the statues look. It changes to the idea of looking at the body and the physique as telling the story rather than the person, rather than their expression and their eyes, if you can't see that type of thing. And then a fun little spin-off is because we have misinterpreted that these statues had color for so long, it actually affected how we did things architecturally during the Renaissance, and everything down to garden gnomes or garden gargoyles, which no longer, or which many of which don't have color, which is a really interesting way that this still affects us today. So now we're going to try and find the truth within the myths here. What did these statues look like? Why did they look this way? And what stories were they telling? This is Farnese Hercules. Farnese Hercules is by far the most buff, the most large of these statues physically. The story that Farnese Hercules specifically is telling is one of strength being worn down. We can see him here in this pose as he is slouched over, he is tired, he is beaten down. And this story is telling one not of his aesthetics, not of how big he could get, but of the fact that his strength could be worn down. The typical Greek person did not have the genetics for this. The typical Greek person did not eat enough protein to look this way. And the reason for that was Greece was primarily fed by fisheries. So the average Greek would have probably eaten very little protein. What little of it would have come from fish. And most of it would have come from other Mediterranean diet staples like cucumbers, onions, that sort of thing. And the lasting effects of these statues is particularly coming from Rome, the idea of strength, right? Of strength not being just of mind, but of body, and talking about this incredible time of war, but war also being beautiful. In a 1974 article titled "The Stones Can Speak," the author states about the statues, they speak of beauty in a world of violence. Some of the world's most beautiful architecture, some of the most perfect pieces of sculpture. And then the final point I want to leave this off with is the idea of bodybuilding image. Because this was something that we thought was achievable in the ancient world, it became something we achieved in the modern world. We have been chasing these aesthetics of bodies for many, many years. And recently we have gotten closer and closer to becoming the things that were never meant to reflect humanity. And in summary, what we have covered is the embodiment of these statues, the colors of these statues, and the stories they tell. And thank you so much.